Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Beyond the Bay Live. This is brought to you by the Bay Community Theater as part of our service to our community. We appreciate everybody who's on right now. I'm Larry. I'm your host, moderator, and also referee in trying to keep track of all the technology. So thank you very much for being here today. Other people will be logging in, and sure, in a minute or two. Let's start out. We have two presenters or two people who are going to talk about the film tonight, and the first one is going to be Kevin. Kevin. Okay. So Kevin, I'm trying to unmute you here, Kevin. There we go. I just lost you. Can you log back in, Kevin? All right, let's start with Kevin. Ted. Okay, Ted, you have to unmute yourself, please.
Okay, so all I'm right. On.
Yeah, Kevin. So Ted, you're there, and Ted's a film historian, and we were still working out technology issues, but we have him back today live. Last week we lost him early on. Today we lost Kevin, so hopefully Kevin comes back on. I don't know what happened there. So Ted is a film historian, and he has a lot of experience in over 3,000 films in his closet. So he basically has the history of film in his house. I'm hoping Kevin does get back to us here soon. Something happened there, and I understand why. But let's get started. Tonight's film is about Some Like It Hot, the 1959 Billy Wilder film that is rated by the American Film Institute as the #1 comedy of all time. Okay, so here's Kevin back again.
Back.
Yeah. So Kevin. Yeah. So Kevin, there, we got you back. Sorry. That was my fault. I guess the thing is you have to unmute yourselves. We're just discovering that. So I was trying to click you and it wouldn't allow me to do that. So Kevin is a industry professional, and he runs the film list, the top 10 film list. Kevin Maher, I see. I should get you all over here. So I'm really messed up right now. There you go. He runs top10filmlist.com. He's worked for major studios, including 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers. He's got a master's degree in filmography, film studies. And we welcome here to how he helps us out with all the little projects on our programming team. Both Kevin and Ted are on the programming team, and they help to select the films for us here. So we really appreciate their time. So get started today with Some Like It Hot, the question and answer period. Let's go first with each of you starting out with a short introduction to the film about why you think this film is important to film history. Kevin, we'll let you go first.
Sure. Why it's important to film history to me is because it's sort of Billy Wilder, who I think is the best or one of the best filmmakers in the classic Hollywood period. And this is him at the peak of his powers, along with Sunset Boulevard and Double Indemnity and The Apartment. Billy Wilder made a handful of some of the greatest films of all time, and Some Like It Hot in its mashup of different genres, and it's the best performance by Marilyn Monroe. I think elevates it beyond just your formula comedy and makes it something subversive and exciting all at the same time.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Kevin. And Ted, what do you feel about this?
Well, what's interesting is this is the same year that was made as the movie we saw last week, 1959. And I'll throw my little bit in here. Where we had Cary Grant last week, now we have an imitation of Cary Grant. And why I bring that up is that all through this movie, and this is Billy Wilder is, from my point of view, is not a he doesn't use cinematic means. He doesn't use the camera. He doesn't do tricks and things like that. He's a dialogue guy. And he'll be the first one to admit it. I read somewhere where he said what he does is he sets his camera up so that he can so you can see the see the actors do their lines. And what the Cary Grant part is that for Tony Curtis at one point to be the sophisticated rich guy, he takes on a Cary Grant imitation. And at one point, Jack Lemmon says, "Who talks like that anyhow?" So there are all these little things in the movie like that that got me. And there's George Raft and there's Pat O'Brien. So not only do you have this kind of modern, subject matter or themes and things like that with or things that couldn't have been done in the old days, it's still part of it is a throwback to the old Warner Brothers. At least at the beginning, the Warner Brothers gangster films. And there's another neat scene where one of the young gangsters is flipping a coin, and George Raft grabs it and says, "Hey, where'd you get that anyhow?" And that was George Raft's his trademark, was flipping a coin like that. So the enjoyment for me in this movie is all those little things that come up here and there, and they're really like throwaway lines. And of course there's all the kind of interesting sexuality going on in there, not just the what's interesting is when Curtis and Lemon are dressed as women, they get to see what the women were going through, getting pinched and slapped and all that kind of thing, and that's an interesting comment on things too. So that's my beginning. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ted. That brings us to a very good first question for the show today, is basically which scene is most effective in pointing out these role reversals you mentioned, as far as when do they discover, or how do they discover the difference that they're the women and the men, and how the women are treated versus instead of being a man. Anybody want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think the opening scene when in the train station, it's 24 minutes into the film, and it's the shot right before it is when Tony Curtis goes into his Josephine voice, and then they cut right to the backs of two women walking down the train station platform, and Wilder sets it up for the punchline, which is his next shot, which is then a flipping the camera 180 degrees to show that it's Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, Jerry and Joe, now dressed in drag. And I think his next shot, as he progresses through that scene, he sort of sets up this dichotomy between men dressed as women and Marilyn Monroe, who is sort of the pinnacle of womanhood, or however you want to argue it. Because as he cuts to them, he then stops, and so there you go. There's the establishing shot of two women walking down a train platform, but then he cuts immediately right to the punchline of Joe and Jerry dressed up in drag. Then the next shot is those two each in their own solo shot, which gives the immediate what kind of woman they're going to play. Joe becomes more of a prim, proper, while Jerry is more of the down and outer, and certainly not as elegant a woman. Then he cuts to the next shot again. In 3 and 4, you see in 4 where they start to have trouble walking. So it plays on that. And then in this one, he cuts again to the two of them, and that's when Jack Lemmon complains that, how do they walk in these things? Tony Curtis says it's a weight distribution thing. And then he says, and why are they not sick? It's a little drafty in here wearing a skirt. So they're immediately identifying the differences between men and women, certainly from a clothing standpoint anyway. And then to put an exclamation point on it, the next cut, because they're distracted, is Sugar, Marilyn Monroe, walking down the platform. They obviously follow her. And again, to hit a punchline, Wilder cuts right to the same rear shot that he had of the other two women, showing how a genuine article woman would walk down the plane platform. And then the final shot sort of this little scene is the punctuation, both visual and verbal, when she gets blasted by blasted by the steam, And then it cuts back to the two guys, and they both say, how does she do it? It's like Jello on springs. And that's the verbal punchline. So it takes it right through real women, fake women, men, women, and it sort of ties it all together in just a few, probably what, 6 or 8, 10 shots that are pretty quick. So that's how he does it.
And Ted, would you like to add anything to that?
He covered it pretty well. I just think it's the banter that goes through the whole thing. Like I mentioned before, is they're always commenting on how they're seeing the other side of things, it's things they didn't really expect, or they didn't realize before that, So, but they certainly.
Well, I love.
But the other thing is they're really enjoying being part of the group too, with the women. At first, Jack Lemmon kind of, he needs a little booze in him, and once he gets the booze in it, there's that sense of camaraderie with the other women that is really enjoyable too. And I don't know if you actually see that much in films of women having a good time all together like that. So that's kind of neat too. And it doesn't really talk about music or anything like that, but they're not put down for being they're shown as being very good musicians. They're not Stokowski comes up and they talk about classical music a little in these throwaway lines, but they're treated as being a professional. The women are as professionals, which is which is really good too.
Mm-hmm. And we have a comment from Rita Wessels. And
Rita,
yes, Rita.
Yeah, it's a great.
And this quote, she's brought up this thing is role reversal, the bellhop flirting for a date with Josephine in a hotel. At the beginning when they arrive, the flirt guy, he's flipping his tie. I like that little routine he's got, his bow tie. He delivers the luggage and he starts flirting just the way that Joe did with the lady at the talent agency. And when Jack Lemmon or Geraldine, or actually Daphne now, she shows up, what happens is that Daphne wants to get out of there and Geraldine doesn't want to, but he says, you know what? They got a real hard time with all this. He's like reversing the roles. These two guys are now seeing it from different angles and playing off of each other and switching what their purpose is and their identity. I thought it was pretty good, but they're coming to the realization about how they treat women, I think. So that's a good point by Rita Wessels.
Yeah, in that scene when it plays out, because Jack Lemmon is or Daphne's complaining about being pinched on the elevator by Osgood. And Tony Curtis said, it doesn't even matter what you look like. You put a skirt on, it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. And it's sort of their idea of now how women feel getting exploited and harassed and, treated indiscriminately. Joe, who's obviously a cad who hits on and uses women. He never changes, but he hits on and uses women as his general MO, and even he can see that there's a different state of things when you're a woman.
So this also brings us to another question here from Ted. Hi, Ted. Thank you. It's good to see you again. Was Tony Curtis's female voice dubbed in the film?
I don't know.
So, Kevin, do you know?
It was actually, it was definitely dubbed. Tony Curtis was actually doing it in more of a falsetto voice and did it in the falsetto all the way through filming. And when they went back and looked at the final rough cut together, they just found it too grating. So they actually dubbed it to what you finally hear in the film. So all of Josephine's speaking is a dubbed voice. It wasn't.
Yes, Kevin, you're starting to break up a bit. I wonder if people are using your bandwidth in your house. So, but yeah, the thing with
let me go chase them up.
So when we also look at Cary Grant, it was mentioned before by Ted that Cary Grant was actually speaking like Cary, Tony Curtis was speaking like Cary Grant. And this role, what he did the whole time is, so Tony, you have to wonder what is Tony Curtis's real voice when you hear the movie, because the falsetto was bad enough, and they had to redub it using a professional voiceover person who did cartoons and other things at that time. And he was had to do all the lines for Tony Curtis there. And then Tony Curtis goes into this Cary Grant role. And I just want to ask you guys, what did you think of his Cary Grant imitation?
Well, it seems to come and
nobody talks like that.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say, nobody talks like that.
I
thought it was pretty good. So
just
it comes and goes. I mean, sometimes he does it better than other times.
No.
Here, let me throw out another thing about Cary Grant. I was thinking about him, and there's a movie called what's the one from the 30s with the tiger and everything. Well, at any rate, actually, with Howard Hawks, he played Bring Up Baby, right? Well, in there he wears a dress at one point, and then there's a whole movie he did with Howard Hawks called I Was a Male War Bride, where he's in drag through the whole thing. So there, I'm just throwing that out there that the couple other movies that I know about of famous actors in drag is Cary Grant. So I don't know. I won't say anything more than that.
Okay. All right. We have another question here from Susan Egan that is good and appropriate for all that. Now, did Marilyn Monroe have a good working relationship with Billy Wilder? Who wants to take that?
That's a very complicated answer. 4 years earlier, I think 3 or 4 years earlier, they had done the 7-Year Itch, and it was not easy for Wilder to shoot with Marilyn Monroe after that. But they sent her the script for this when she became interested, and he took it on. And she had changed emotionally and professionally in between that period of time. She had come under the sort of the power of the Strasbergs in the Actors Studio in New York. And in fact, when she would finish a scene, she would look over to Paula Strasberg, who was sitting in the wings. And if Paula nodded her head, then they could proceed on to another setup. If Paula shook her head, then Marilyn would insist on doing another take. At one point, Wilder even turned to Paula Strasberg and said, "Paula, how was that for you? Are you good with that?" Before moving on to another, obviously in jest. But their relationship on this film deteriorated to the point where after the fact, they actually traded quite a bit of back and forth in the press. At one point, Arthur Miller blamed Billy Wilder for Marilyn's miscarriage that she suffered 2 or 3 days after filming ended. And this was all brought into the press. And Billy Wilder said that on advice from his psychiatrist, his doctor, and his accountant, he could not, for health reasons, ever work with Marilyn Monroe again. He ended up trying to apologize to her. Marilyn called Billy's house after the attempted apology and told Billy Wilder's wife to tell Billy that he can go blank himself. And that was pretty much the culmination of the deterioration of their relationship during the filming of this. So at the end, no, they did not have any type of relationship. But it was, we can get into Marilyn's behavior on set and what caused that. But if any person was patient, it was Wilder during the shooting of this movie.
Ted, your thoughts on that?
When I saw my copy of this movie was for taped from Turner Classic Movies with Robert Osborne, and he made a point that there was so much trouble with Marilyn Monroe, and then somebody asked him why didn't he fire Marilyn Monroe, and he said, "Well, I could have my aunt come on, and she could be on time, and she could say the lines absolutely perfect, but I don't think anybody would pay to see my aunt in that role." So Marilyn Monroe had a lot of star power, and obviously it works. I mean, it's when it doesn't detract. I mean, here we are talking about the background of the movie, And to me, you really can't see it on the screen. Apparently, it was a fairly troubled production, but once you edited it and putting all the pieces together, it really flows really well. So that's Hollywood for you, you know, they're producing a product, and it really worked out well, even though not everybody was getting along personally.
Yeah.
Well, going on with some Marilyn there, because this is Marilyn had a lot of problems during filming, and again, she had a miscarriage, and it caused a lot of problems, and so you don't really know what's going on. And Tony Curtis actually, after the filming, said, you know, she's not going to last more than 2 more movies, and she did. She died a few years later after this. So who knows? But I actually, like Ted was saying, I thought her performance was pretty good. There's times in there where you can pick up she's reading from your cue cards or whatever they had for her. But I think she does pretty good for this movie. I think she was really good in the role. So
and I would
I
go ahead.
Go ahead, Ted.
I was just going to say.
Well, I said at the top, I think this is her.
Go ahead, Kevin. Go.
Okay, like I said at the top, I think this is her best performance. And the ironic thing is that The Misfits, which she did 2 years later and was her last role, is probably her second best performance. It's just the fact that she was so insecure, so riddled with self-doubt, and then it didn't help that she was addicted to painkillers and booze, and having her marriage was disintegrating. She had the miscarriage coming into the movie. She got pregnant while they were filming the movie. Tony Curtis claimed it was his later, but then she had the miscarriage right after. So she was a mess. And it's so sad, because I think there's a lot of Marilyn in Sugar. If you look at some of the scenes when she talks about her past and being used by men and being discarded, being treated poorly, having a rough childhood. I mean, a lot of what she was channeling for this role came from her background. And it's amazing that she could do that in a couple scenes and then still be, gut laughter funny, intentionally funny in other scenes. So I mean, the baseline is she was a fantastic actress, performer. But they said when they were filming it, you couldn't see it. It's just once it hits the big screen, she just lights up, and it's truly amazing. I think she's just an amazing performer. So it's just tragic. I mean, that's overdone, but it's tragic.
Yeah, it is tragic. So let's go on to another question.
Throw in the alcohol problem too, for sure.
Yeah, it was the telling. That's where this was a sugar. Marilyn Monroe was sugar. There's another question from Lisa related to this. Is how did they get Marilyn's dress tops past the censors? Some were quite provocative at the time. So, how did that happen? How did they get this past it? So this is from the love scene here, where that dress that she has on. I mean, how did that happen? Anybody want to comment on that? Or
it sells tickets.
It sells tickets.
Well, we talked about this briefly last week. In 1959, there was a transition in the Production Code Administration office, and a new guy, I think it was Jeffrey Sherlock was his name, was brought on, and he was more lenient towards famous directors. So last week we talked about how Hitchcock got away with some stuff. Wilder got away with some stuff on this one too. Not just to mention the verbal innuendo that was flying around. But the dresses were incredibly provocative, but they were very careful to cover up what needed to be covered up. I mean, you can't get any lower cut in the back, and you can't get much lower cut in the front. But at the end of the day, that's all you can see is skin. So they got around it.
So I like this comment regarding all this stuff too, is that the women are all the stronger characters throughout. What'd you guys say about that one?
I mean, okay. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a very good comment, and because it's an observation. So the question I have sometimes is, who's the real who's the real leading role here? Is it Marilyn Monroe and the other female leads, or is it Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon? Or are they just around for the women to show off?
Well, when they were having the greatest problem with Marilyn, because she was hospitalized for a weekend and then unavailable for about a week, it was mid-shoot, and they actually considered replacing her. Billy Wilder, Ted gave Billy Wilder's cavalier response when people talked about that, but they talked about Natalie Wood, Mitzi Gaynor again, who was originally considered to star in it, and Carol Baker, who was sort of a poor man's Marilyn Monroe, were all considered to replace the part. But at the end of the day, it is Marilyn's film. It does, everything revolves around Sugar's character from the minute she hits the screen. And now, if you look at Wilder's camera, clearly Jack Lemmon is who Wilder loves in this film. He spends more time on Lemmon, in total than he does on any other character. But it's Marilyn's film because she's central to everything that sort of revolves around her, as it was in most of her films. She's sort of the sun that everything revolves around.
Okay. That's very good. I got another question coming up to you from Amy here.
Another thing. Can I just throw another thing in there?
Sure.
Go back to that. And that the fact that Tony Curtis and the two guys are women, and that gives Marilyn Monroe's character, the Sugar character, to talk about those things that we were saying before, her background and all that. So it's kind of an interesting an interesting kind of way into doing something personal there.
Yeah.
If they were just the male characters, that none of that dialogue, none of those scenes would have happened, and none of that kind of personal information would have come out. And it's because she was confiding to them as a woman to woman kind of thing, which made it again. I'm not sure if you can really see that kind of thing in many other Hollywood films, that kind of women to women kind of talking. And maybe the only way they could get away with it is because they were men in drag. I mean, it's an interesting kind of thought,
Yeah. Well, yeah, when you put the fundamental of a farce and you build this much commentary on sexual identity, on class politics, on gender politics, you can get away with a lot. I look at Jerry/Daphne. He's his best person when he's a she. He's happier. He's more outgoing. He's a much better person when he's Daphne than he is when he's Jerry.
Oh, there's that scene when he's on the bed with the maracas, and after
yes.
that night, it's just a wonderful thing that Lemmon does.
Yes. Why would a guy marry another guy?
Security.
Security. Exactly. So there are norms and conventions.
So we got another question here. This is from Amy. And she says, open scenes feel like an action film. It's kind of dark. It starts out with a hearse going down the street. The cops are chasing it. Their machine guns are blaring. Then there's a lot of the speakeasy gets raided. And then all of a sudden it's the shooting in the garage. Was this considered a violent film for the time or for black and white movies? Anybody want to go first on that?
Well, it's sort of a takeoff on the 30s.
Yeah.
And these days the guns went a little louder and a little flashier, but I just think it was a kind of a parody of that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I agree completely. And remember, the gangster films of the early 30s were one reason why the production code and the censors came into being in the first place. So it sort of wraps a little bow around, almost 30 years of Hollywood history by starting off with the gangster films in the 30s and, parodying them to a large degree, and then ending up in the 50s in a movie taking place in the 20s. So again, it's Wilder wrapping, circular arguments to build up I don't know where the analogy would go, to build up something that's awesome.
Well, he creates a dark scene at the beginning, then towards the end again too. And Ted has a related question to that, and that's was there any issue upon release of this with the violence and the killing combined with the farce? And do you think these two elements would be allowed together in a film today?
Of course, today.
Well, Joe Mankiewicz, who I always get the Mankiewiczes confused. One of them directed All About Eve, and the other one wrote Citizen Kane. But he watched the preview of this and came out and shook his head and said, you can't do this. It's it's going to be a flop. And David O. Selznick, who produced Gone with the Wind, said you can't have bullets and gut laughter, blood and gut laughter within the same 10 minutes. And so he also said this is going to be a bomb and a disaster. So while they could do it back then and get away with it, most insiders were shaking their heads, say it's not going to work. So, and could they do it now? Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example, but there has to be. I'm sure one of our listeners can come up with one, but I can't think of one right off the top of my head that would be a mixture of farce and violence. One could argue every Sylvester Stallone movie ever made, but I wouldn't do that. So
there's another thing about the censorship and all that, and there's 2 points I make. The censorship in '59, the television was just dragging away the audiences from the theaters, and so they had to do more provocative kinds of things in the cinema to draw the crowds in, to get people to pay their money with, and so the saccharine kinds of things were on the television, and so for the more adult and the more sexy kinds of things and more violent things, they would make these movies, just like we saw with North by Northwest, and there's a whole bunch of other movies from this time. And, Psycho came that way too, a year later. But part of it was pure economics. They wanted to make movies and they wanted to make money. So you have to change the type of subject matter too. Another thing is Wilder is known to be kind of a cynical kind of guy. And he mixed a lot of genres and that kind of thing. So that was part of his shtick too, was to make very different kinds of movies than people were used to, and expectations in movies, that kind of thing. So it's part of Wilder's background too. And while I've got the back, it's interesting that the first 3 movies we've seen here have been directed by filmmakers that were not Americans. Pulaski was Poland, Hitchcock was English, and Wilder came from Austria. And he was part of a whole bunch of filmmakers that came over from Vienna and Germany, some of them just for the money of it, but a lot of them, like Wilder and Fritz Lang, came over for the to escape from Hitler and all that kind of thing. So I'm just pointing that out, that here we have these movies about America made by people that were outsiders from America.
So I just want to wrap this up here a little bit too, is because the questions were about the violence in the film and all the stuff going on and the bad guys being really bad. And that was probably the reason why George Raff was the person in the movie that was previously always known for his characters and gangster movies and everything else. And even the flipping of the coin, like it was mentioned before, was actually his shtick in one of the previous movie. And what is interesting about this is George Raft is doing this, and he's playing this tough guy, and yet he also is in the background. And if you read about the film, he actually was teaching Joe E. Brown and Jack Lemmon how to dance tango together. And there's clips and there's pictures of that and everything else. So he was having a grand time. He thought this was a farce. But I think the impact of the filming and everything else, and just having him on present, made it seem dark. But that's a very good topic. Let's move on to something else. There is a question here from Elizabeth Egan here. And this one is, the title of the movie was originally Nobody's Perfect. What is the story behind the title change?
Well, Wilder liked the nursery rhyme. Some like it in a porridge, some like it in a pot, 9 days old, some like it in a, whatever that one is, some like it in it's hot, something like that. So he was always playing around with that. And I think that Nobody's Perfect was just a placeholder line in the last scene. It wasn't really meant to be to stay there. They just put a pin in it because they started production without the finale, which Wilder and Diamond always did. But there was a couple different names that they had thought about, but Some Like It Hot was actually a 1939 Bob Hope movie. So they had to wait for clearance because at that point you couldn't use a title that had been, they can't copyright them, but that had already been in the public use. There was an agreement with the Producers Guild. So they had to get clearance. And luckily, Billy Wilder's agent bought, Lou Wasserman was his name, bought all of the Paramount movies made before 1950. And Some Like It Hot was a Paramount movie from 1939. So Wilder got his title, but for a while there were different placeholders in place. I'm sure Nobody's Perfect was one of them, but it was all waiting for Some Like It Hot. They just had to get clearance.
And so when we look at Some Like It Hot, and what does Some Like It Hot reference really? So Some Like It Hot, I just know is that Some Like It Hot is it's actually spoken in the movie about the jazz. I think actually Marilyn Monroe references it. So hot jazz was the type of jazz they played, fast moving, lively, hot jazz, instead of sweet jazz, which is a little smoother and softer. And so Some Like It Hot was in reference to the band and the type of music they had, and they liked having that hot jazzy thing. And this movie has that feeling of a hot jazzy environment throughout, all the time, all the partying and all the music. So I think that's what and so the movie title, like you said, Kevin was saying, they're waiting for it to clear, and they just pick Nobody's Perfect because that ends up being the ending line of the movie. So
remember, a little heat will steam up your glasses too. I was just going to say, a little heat will steam up your glasses too. So, everybody likes it hot. Obviously, Some Like It Hot has veiled sexual references as well. So let's be clear about Wilder's true intents.
Right. Another one from Dave here. Hi, Dave. Good to see you again. Any reason why Sugar was from Sandusky, Ohio? Because you have mentioned Sheboygan. You have Sandusky. You have Champaign-Urbana. Why Sandusky, do you think?
I have no idea. I tried because someone else had emailed me a question very similar to this, and I have no idea why they were picking on Midwestern town names, but they did throughout the whole thing. So who knows? Just Wilder and Diamond being
Hollywood people thinking that this was small town America, and these people came from nowhere, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Again, I'm saying, Wilder was German. He wasn't. He didn't.
Right.
He was Viennese even. I mean, that's even more than German. With sophistication and that kind of thing. So it might be kind of a little put down kind of thing too.
Yeah.
All right. So Christian has a nice question here about being dressed in drag. It was out of the norm in 1959. What do you think made this movie more? Do you think this movie made it What do you think make this movie so successful and classic? Do you think it opened the door for similar movies?
Well, I mean, the whole thing of Men in Drag, someone made a point that it goes all the way back to Shakespeare and even before then. So while it wasn't in the norm, if you look at the history of Hollywood, and Ted brought up one was I Was a Male War Bride with Cary Grant in drag. But there's a long history of movies sort of sporadically sprinkled I guess that's the only way you could have it, throughout, where both men were dressing as women and women were dressing as men, as a simple plot device, or if it was something that they carried through to try and make a social or a political comment about the time. In the 30s, it was Garbo and Dietrich who routinely dressed as men in their films. And then there's obviously a lot of slapstick comedians in the 20s. It's a great visual cue for a farce, or for slapstick, or simply for hilarious. So like I said, in the train station scene, the punctuation, the punchline is seeing them in drag. So I don't know if it had as much to do with the film's success solely, but it's just a finely constructed story with great dialogue that I think helps make it a classic, and made it so successful at the time. And one little aside, they're all asides, but someone mentioned the American Film Institute had named it the #1 comedy. The #2 comedy that they ranked was Tootsie, another cross-dressing movie. So apparently the blue ribbon panel that chose the AFI's list were very keen on cross-dressing as a plot point.
Okay. We also have this, I've been looking through here, and there's a lot of good comments going on about the film and everything else. And I like this question here. It's not a question, but a statement. And Marilee, I also agree with this. I was saying it this week to the team and everything else. There's no women talking, and we do need a woman's viewpoint. We're all volunteers. We're looking for somebody. We're looking for people. We invited
someone, and she said she wasn't ready yet. So stay tuned.
Yes, stay tuned. We're hoping that person does step up, because it would be good. But we do want to get the women's viewpoint involved here, because this film could have really used it in this discussion. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. And we're working on it. And again, we're a nonprofit, and we're all volunteers, and we're just trying to help connect with the community. And
we're just starting doing this too.
Yeah.
So all these kind of comments are really helpful.
Yes, it is. We're liking this very much. So let's see here. I saw another one in here too. We're talking about Pulp Fiction and stuff. Where was that question here?
I think that goes to the farce with violence. I think that was to that one.
Yes. And I have another question here that I think is something to consider. How does this movie fall on the timeline of Hope and Crosby buddy movies? These reminded me of those. And I like comedies where there's a buddies, or there's two people that are just buddies through the movie, and they're just playing off of each other, and all these things are going around them. And I like this with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. I think they did a pretty good job, but then they actually throw Marilyn into the mix between the three of them. And but what did you guys think about the buddy movie aspect of this?
Ted, you want that one?
Well, not real. I don't really have anything to say other than it's a good way to involve the audience. They from the very beginning they seem to. In fact, I guess there's really no background for these guys other than a couple of musicians, but they really fall into that classic Laurel and. There's sort of a little Laurel and Hardy in it, where the one guy is dominating the other one. And they keep switching back and forth, and they seem to really enjoy each other as companions and that kind of thing. So I'd say that. And the other thing I would say is why this is a classic movie and so successful is the casting just makes it happen. I'm going a little off topic here, but apparently the original casting was supposed to be Frank Sinatra, Danny Kaye, and Mitzi Gaynor. And you put your head around that, and you can't really see how this movie would fit with those people in it. But the casting here really works well, and especially, like you say, the buddies of Lemmon and Curtis, they really play off each other well as performers. So that you might have more to say about this buddy stuff.
I was just going to have a sort of a different take on it. And as far as the buddy movies, those the Hope and and Crosby were, I think, in the 40s, most of those.
Yeah.
But if you look at what Wilder's trying to do here with couples, when Jerry and Joe start off, they're essentially a bickering married couple. Joe is the carefree with cash, fly by the seat of his pants, whereas Jerry is more the constructive one, looking out to make sure they have their coats because it's going to get cold, more the nurturing one of the two, sort of. If you want to get sex at the time, he has the more feminine role, where Joe is the more masculine role. So they're actually a married couple, which you look at a lot of buddy pictures, they do set it up that way, where they're a couple. They may not make it as overt as that, but at one point, Daphne even says, that we've been living together for 3 years, sharing everything, working together. So they're a married couple. And Wilder sets up all these couples throughout the film. They're just the first one in the first 24 minutes. It's Joe and Jerry as a couple. Then it moves on to, Daphne and Josephine are a couple. And then Sugar sort of slides in between there and eventually splits off with Junior to form another couple, while Daphne and Osgood form a third couple. So it's all about the couples. Yeah, right. None of them are perfect, as to paraphrase. But every good buddy movie has at its core, the buddies are a couple in some way, shape, or form. So that's my spin on what Wilder was trying to do with Off the Buddy movie.
Well, let's take a look at from this question from Mia. Are we to assume that Jack Lemmon's character and Osgood stay together? I mean, this still is a classic line. This is still the classic images. He says, but I can't do this. I'm a man. And then Osgood comes back and says, but nobody's perfect. And then I love this scene here, the shot, because you can actually see the next shot where Jack Lemmon is just looking off. I can't believe this. The sun is setting behind him. And it's just a really well set piece, a shot piece. And we were talking about buddies then, is that you ended up with Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe, then Joey Brown and Jack Lemmon. And so they're the couples that were throughout. There's, like you said, there's a lot of different couple pairings up, and it ends up being this at the end. And what do you guys think? Do they stay together?
Yes. I think they lived happily ever after, because this is the marriage number 8 for Osgood.
Right.
He knows exactly what he's getting into, and nobody is perfect. And he's the authentic person in the entire movie.
Yes.
Everybody else is a bunch of fakers, for good or for bad. He's the only genuine article. He's not, pretending to be a millionaire. He's not pretending to be, the rich gentrified gangsters. He's not pretending to be a Vassar or Bryn Mawr girl out on a lark. He is who he is. And, once he realizes Daphne / Jerry, who he is, hey man, nobody's perfect. They're fine. I think they had the most sturdy and safe relationship in the whole film. Because I'll tell you one thing, Sugar and Joe, that ain't gonna last.
I never really thought about it, so I just thought it was a good way to end the movie.
It was a good way to end the movie. It's like
brilliant. Great question.
Great question. So let's go on to another question here that had come up earlier. The film itself has a lot of different little nuggets in the movie. For instance, there's the points where Jack Lemmon is grilling Tony Curtis in the bathtub, but behind Jack Lemmon, you notice that there is actually the shades are moved. And then also when Tony Curtis is taking and shoving across the scene the corsage with the diamond bracelet in it, which to his buddy, he took his bracelet and shoves it across there. You see actually a shadow behind the other door. And the question was, it came up, was this something that was a favorite technique in other Billy Wilder films, where he's seeing people and completing the whole package? A lot of times you would just see don't see the background. You won't really see those things, but all those little telltale clues were throughout the movie. What do you guys think about this as a technique of Billy Wilder?
Go, Kevin.
Well, if you want to go all the way back, as Ted mentioned, Billy Wilder came out of Vienna, was a protege of Ernst Lubitsch, who's also a famous German filmmaker. So he came out of the German expressionist movement of filmmakers, which, essentially they created film noir. And one of the great tenets of film noir is the mix of light and shadow and the use of Venetian blinds and giving more three-dimensionality to the image through shadow, light and shadow, and the play between the two. So I think more so of what Wilder was doing in the background of his shots is giving more depth to them, because clearly in the scene where where Joe is behind the door after sliding the bracelet across, you see that shadow move. It's not important except for the fact to know that he's there listening, right? Your focus is solely on Sugar's response to that gift. So I think it's just a depth thing. I'm sure you could find it in other Wilder movies, but I think there's the consistency of just getting a three-dimensional space going in different ways, right? There's lots of different ways that directors trick us to make our eye move around. So that'd be my take. It's a great question, though. It's very interesting to look at Wilder's films in that way, though.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, I think I got it from you in your introduction, but or I read it someplace, is that the reason it's in black and white was to subdue the flamboyance of the here we go. Subdue the flamboyance of the drag, and it said it in that period too, was that their drag, they could dress the way they did and drag and not seem too out of line with the other the women at that time. That was in your talk, I guess, right?
Yeah, and there was a lot of directors. Wilder hated filming in color. He said it was like filming inside a jukebox because everybody was blues and reds and flashing lights and all this stuff. And he was one of a lot of directors who went kicking and screaming into color photography because you could get more, especially looking at film noir, and you get that nuances between light and dark and sunlight and darkness, and that interplay was far more interesting for directors to shoot. So he wanted this in black and white, yes, like you said, because it was set in the 1920s, but also because he hated color film. He'd much rather. The interesting, I think I mentioned it, in the introduction, that Marilyn Monroe, by contrast, had the stipulation that everything she was in had to be in Technicolor, and they showed her some pictures of Lemon and Curtis in drag, and she agreed to go along with the black and white.
I agree. I saw some of those production photos, and I was like, oh, I'm glad they made this thing in black and white. So another question, we're coming down the last 5 minutes here. How did Wilder and Diamond work together on the scripts? I mean, we've talked about in other sessions we've had previously. Did they both work on the dialogue? And how did it change once Marilyn had signed on? Did they alter it at all? Was there any, because I'll let Kevin start on this, because I know you have Kevin
knows about this.
Yes. Yeah, well, they, like I said, I think in my introduction, they did 12 films together over about 25-year period, and they considered themselves bankers. They would punch in every morning at 9. They would stay together in one room till 6. They could sit for hours in silence, but they always just punched in and got their work in, and they would throw ideas back and forth, and Diamond would type them all down, and Wilder would throw them away. So they worked very methodically through a script. And like I said, they never went into filming with the completed script, because they wanted to have room for the actors and the performances to potentially dictate a different ending than what they had penciled in. So they never wanted to be nailed down with that. And once Marilyn Monroe was interested, they had sent her when she voiced interest, and they sent her, I think it was about a 10-page synopsis, and she became interested in the part. They expanded Sugar's place in the film. Now, right now, you couldn't imagine it without her at the center of the film, but initially it was just about the two musicians. So they did expand and change the scope of the story, which I'm sure had a great part in changing some of the dialogue. But Wilder and Diamond were two peas in a pod, and like I said, 12 great films, including this one and The Apartment, 1, 2, 3, which if you ever get a chance to watch the most richly packed dialogue film ever conceived, it makes Quentin Tarantino look like a poet who's writing in single verse.
It has to be James Cagney that does the
yes,
the shooting of the dialogue too.
Yes.
All right. So I want to thank you guys tonight. That we're down to the last minute or so here, and just want to thank you very much. But reading through the comments and everything else, yes, foreign film Cinema Paradiso came up as a recommendation, but we're going to be trying to go through right now. It's just we're starting out small, and we appreciate if you tell your friends and everybody else to come back and to watch us on this night, to actually go through and watch the movies and everything else. That would be very helpful. We're glad you people like this, and everybody's working well. And our technology, we stumble around something at the beginning every week so far. So maybe we'll get it right one of these days. I apologize for that.
Next week, we have a different face. You don't have to look at our ugly faces.
Yes. So next week, what we have is we actually are going to, it'll be announced tomorrow and everything be set up tomorrow for it. We're going to have the Breakfast Club. We're going to do the Breakfast Club starting tomorrow. And let me get this up here. And we're going to have the Breakfast Club. And the Breakfast Club, there's an introduction. It's actually already out on our YouTube channel, and I'll be promoting it on the website tomorrow morning on the Breakfast Club. And it was put together by Zeke Smith, who is our projectionist and also our tech who helps run the films in the theater. He's got a TCAP.
Younger than two.
Yeah, and he's did a really nice intro for it, and he's going to be live with us next week. So please tell everybody else we have next week. We're going to have the Breakfast Club. It'll all start tomorrow, Friday through Thursday, ending with this live conversation. Again, we're the Bay Theater in Suttons Bay, Michigan. We're operated by the Bay Community Theater. We're all volunteers here. We appreciate your support and participation. Really like all the comments and all the threads, and we'll get better at this as we go along, all because of you. So thank you very much, and send us emails if you want to suggest films or anything else to beyond@baycommunitytheater.org. Thank you very much. Have a good night, and we'll see you all. And thank you, Ted, and thank you, Kevin.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.